Okay, so let's go into Gemarah. We are 6 rows from the bottom, and it goes the following. Tanan, it's four words from the end of the row, 6 rows from the bottom. Tanan, Yeh Shabbos b'Torah. There is a Shabbos in the Torah. However, one that is motzi mereshut lereshut, patur. One that is exporting from private domain to public domain is exempt. Okay, patur. Now the Gemara says, ve'amai hotza haktiva lo totziu masami bateichem. Yep. Says the Gemara, again, the same kind of challenging. This is an example. The example the Mishnah gave is an example of a ruling that actually the Tzdokim agree with. It's a pshat of the Torah. The Sanhedrin here violated a simple understanding of a pasuk of the Torah. Now look at that. I want to pause here a second. Why? Because they quoted an explicit verse that says that one is not allowed to carry items from one domain to the other. Okay. Now, where is this pasuk quoted from? By the way, it's quoted in Yirmiyahu, in Jeremiah. It's not a pasuk in the Torah. So first of all, you see here something interesting, that the Gemarah here assumes that the Tzdokim concede not only to pshat of the Torah, but they also concede to pshat, what is derived from the way the prophets interpreted the Torah. Okay, lo totziu masami bateichem. That's a commandment of Jeremiah regarding the Shabbos. However, this way or another way, the Gemarah again gives the same kind of challenge. You said that a public bull is brought when the Sanhedrin are saying not to carry from one domain to another domain, but this is a simple ruling that is explicit in the Bible, even if not in the Torah, in the Bible, so that Tzdokim concede to it. Now look at that. If the Mishnah would have brought a different example, let's say that one isn't allowed to cook on Shabbos, then the Gemarah wouldn't have challenged it. Meaning the Gemarah assumes that the drash, from which we derive that the 39 jobs, malachos, are prohibited. How do the sages know that that's our parsha? Our parsha, Yitro, in the 10 Commandments, it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho, Sheshet Yamin ta'avod v'asita kol melachtecha, v'Yom HaShvi Shabbat l'Hashem, Lo ta'aseh kol melacha, thou shalt not do any, how will you translate melacha? Work, job. Lo ta'aseh kol melacha. That's the verse. That's the pshat. So the Tzdokim can interpret it, job, work. The sages are telling us what is the definition of malacha, that one is prohibited from doing on Shabbos. It's all the 39 jobs that were needed in order to build the Mishkan. But now, that's not explicit in the Torah, right? We learn it from the juxtaposition of the presentation, and later on, Parshiot and Sefer Shmot, juxtaposition between the Shabbos and the building of the Mishkan, right? That's the way how they infer it. This the Tzdokim don't need to accept, or they're refusing to accept. So what happened here? If the Mishnah would have brought the example of erasing a category, an entire category, but the example would have been different. The Sanhedrin ruled that there is a Shabbos, but one is allowed to cook on Shabbos. Here the Gemarah wouldn't have any question. So you see that the Gemarah really doesn't challenge the entire principle here, that uprooting a category, even not a detail, is already sufficient to bring a bull. That is not the attack. The attack is that this specific category that the Mishnah brought, meaning the work of Hotza'ah, this one is specifically explicit in verses in the Tanakh. So that was the question of the Gemarah. So the Gemarah answers, the Amrei Hotza'ahu de Asur Achnasa Mutar. I'll tell you, there is the first Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat says that just as exporting from private domain to public domain is prohibited, vice versa is the same. If someone is carrying an object from the public domain to the private domain, even though this is not called hotza'ah, this is called hachnasa. You're bringing in, not exporting, but bringing in to the private domain from the public domain. But the Mishnah assumes that they're identical, that it's prohibited on the same level. Now here, the Gemarah offered that maybe the Tzdokim disagree with that. They're saying we're reading literally. What is prohibited to do is exporting, but bringing in is not written explicitly in the pasuk, so we disagree with it. Now that's a little surprising because here again, where do I draw the line between pshat and drash? Meaning, the fact that these two things are symmetrical is either we say that's included in the Av Malacha, or that these are parallel avos, like cooking and baking. You know, it says cooking, so maybe baking is allowed. But you understand that baking is under the category or a parallel category to cooking. L'chora achnasa is the same. And still, the Gemarah here wants to say that the Tzdokim disagree with that extrapolation of exporting to importing, bringing in. If I'm thinking a little more broad, you know, the Psukim in Yirmiyahu, they have a social context. The exporting, why Bechlal? You know, we know that Bechlal, to understand, cooking is a creative malacha. You're actually changing an object. The same, creating fire. Most malachos involve in this way or another creation. That's why they're prohibited on Shabbos, because you rest from creation. It's a known principle that the 39 jobs are not necessarily attached to physical effort. You know, lighting a match is a very small effort, but yet still you created fire. The focus is that these are 39 categories of creative actions. That's why they're prohibited in Shabbos. Creative and mean that you create something. Cooking, sewing, lighting fire. The only exception to that is the malacha of Hotza'ah. That's why the Rishonim are calling it in the beginning of Masechet Shabbat, melacha gru'ah, a weak malacha. Because what did you really do here? You took one object from one place to another place. You didn't create anything new here, okay? Now, the way it's presented in Jeremiah is very simple. This is an essential component, the exporting of mischar. How do you say mischar? Now a very popular word in the media. Mischar, business. Merchandise. So yes. Carrying from the private domain to the public domain, meaning bringing the merchandise to the shuk, to the market, that's an essential component of work. So now here, perhaps this is the shaila. Perhaps the tzdokim limited it to this, because importing, meaning bringing from the public domain to the private domain, is not directly attached to the work. When am I bringing back from the public domain to the private domain? Either at the end of the day, when I completed the job. So all the leftovers of all the merchandise that is left, I'm bringing back to the store, home, whatever, to lock it. That's really when you encounter it. So I think that our rabbis are saying, and it makes more sense. What do you mean? The whole thing is part of working is not only exporting, but also at the end of the day, bringing it back to the storage. That's part of the business actions. The tzdokim perhaps limited it to the very direct business action, which is to bring it to the market. Whatever happens afterwards is only because you don't want to lose money, is only because, yeah, but that's not the original act of the work. That's after work, okay, for your own needs, but after work. So I think that really what we see here is that the tzdokim take the literal wording, hotzah, and they say only this is included. That's what the Gemarah says. You tell me that actually a regular conduct of a merchant is also to bring back the merchandise home. That's true. There are a lot of things that are regular conducts of a merchant, but that's not directly, that's not the whole action that is prohibited. Whereas the rabbis are saying, what do you mean? Both ways, exporting and bringing in, they're all part of it's true that the verse said hotzah, but it meant that all the transmissions between the domains that are part of the ordinary conduct of a merchant. Okay, let's continue. V'ibai Seima. I'm now four lines from the bottom. V'ibai Seima, the Amre Hotzah de Asira. What is prohibited is merely the exporting and maybe the achnasa also. Moshit v'zorek shari. There are other forms of prohibitions, not carrying, but throwing from one domain to the other. Not carrying, but throwing. Also, there is moshit. There's another guy in the other domain, and I'm just giving it to him. Hoshata. Okay? These two things in the 11th chapter of Masechet Shabbat, it's explicit that they're prohibited as part of Hotzah, but since they're not written, the throwing is not written explicitly, that still can disagree with it. And it's interesting because if we talk about the result being in one domain and ending up in the other domain, what's the difference between carrying and throwing? I would say that that's even the pshat of hotzah. Here it really depends how I interpret the word, whether hotzah is focused on the result or on the action. The tzdokim here are reading it very parsimoniously. It's the action that I am exporting, making an action of exporting, and they assume that throwing is not an action of exporting because the word hotzah, because the verse is lo totziu masami bateichem. Perhaps the verse in Jeremiah is a load, so probably it's talking about a carrying. Okay. Now, so here is what the Gemarah said. So again, the Gemarah brought an ukimta. What was in the pshat of the Mishnah, just they're saying that even when Sanhedrin are ruling, there is no category of hotzah. There is Shabbos, but no category of hotzah. So the pshat of the Mishnah is that one brings the bulls for that such scenario brings a bull. Because of the principle of the tzdokim thing, the Gemarah has to explain that where they're talking about something more limited. They uprooted the importing only, or they uprooted the throwing. That is what they said. That is, here's when a bull is brought. Again, now we're at the end of, now we're 3 rows from the bottom. Tnan, the first word. Tnan, yesh avodas kochavim b'Torah. Aval hamishtachave patur. V'amai hamishtachave aktiva, d'chtiv lo tishtachave le'el acher. Yeah. It's written in the Torah, you should not bow to another, to an idol, to another god. Okay, that's an explicit verse. Lo tishtachave le'el acher. Oh, and here there is a correction, because actually my memory doesn't encounter such a verse. It seems that the quote is not precise. They're probably quoting our 10 commandments. It says, Lo yeh lecha Elohim acharim al panai, the second commandment. Lo tishtachave lahim velo ta'ovdem. The word not to bow is explicit, is an explicit category written in the 10 commandments. So of course the tzdokim agree with it. The 10 commandments says you should not have another god, and specifically you shouldn't bow to it. That's what's written. So how did the Mishnah give this as an example where a public bull is brought? So the Gemara answers, look at that again in Ukimta. The Amrei, second row, Ki asira ishtachavaya kedarka. Aval shalo kedarka sharia. Wow. I would have said, and here, by the way, I could see the example. And by the way, here again, to say that that's how the tzdokim interpreted, the Gemara really gives here a stretch, I think. But let me explain what I mean. If I read the Torah in a so-called, well, I would think a tzedokי way, then it says exclusively every other idol, one should not bow to it. And then we're stuck with our Mishnah. So what is the suggestion of the Gemarah? Here you need to understand a principle in the laws of Avodah Zarah. So let me share it with you. Our sages understand, not the tzdokim, our sages understand that there are 4 categories, jobs, malachot, yeah, within Avodah Zarah. One should not bow in front of her. One should not bring a sacrifice. Okay. Lishtachavot, I think to shecht, to throw the blood, and probably to lactir, to actually put it on the altar. Meaning, you have an idol. So they took the 4 avodos that we're doing in the Mikdash, shechting, throwing the blood, okay, okay, and they add bowing. Oh, shechting, throwing the blood, and actually putting it in the altar, and bowing. These are, I believe these are the 4 categories that are asur in Avodah Zarah, always, to any idol. That's how our sages understand. And there is another prohibition in Avodah Zarah, important, to worship the Avodah Zarah in its manner. Meaning, each Avodah Zarah had its own form that the goyim, the idol worshippers, the practice that they were using. Let's say, we'll give the extreme example, with Peor, the idol of Peor, the way these idol worshippers were worshiping it is to do your bathrooms in front of it. That was the way they worshipped Peor. So a Jew is not allowed to do that. So a Jew is actually, if I take Peor, that's one form of idol, there are 5 things I'm not allowed to do for Peor. I'm not allowed to bow. And even though they don't bow to it, to Peor, that's not the form they're worshiping Peor, the Gentiles. They're doing it only in the way I said, the bathroom way. But since bowing is, we'll call it objectively a worship, or that's a worship that we apply only to God, the true God, therefore, you're not allowed to bow to any idol, even if that's not the form of the idol worshipers of worshiping that idol. Okay, got it? So you understand there are 4 ways that are absolutely prohibited. And then there is another way, which is just not to do the classic way of worshiping that idol. Now, what the Gemarah here offers is the following. The Mishnah said that the Sanhedrin that said, the Mishnah said that a Sanhedrin that rules that one is that there is avodah zarah in the Torah, but one is prohibited, but one is allowed to bow to it. That's a mistake that a public bull is brought. I was a little puzzled about that when we learned the Mishnah, but we said, yeah, what can we say? The Mishnah probably says that davar velo chatzi davar excludes only a concept, uprooting an entire concept. But if you uprooted even a big category within the concept, meaning bowing, then this, even though it's a very evident mistake, but it's already in the category of a ruling, and a public bull is brought. Now the Gemarah says, but how come it's a very evident ruling that Tzdokim agree that one is not allowed to bow to idols? So how come the Mishnah says that a public bull is brought when the Sanhedrin ruled that one is allowed to bow? That Tzdokim even agree that one is not allowed to bow. It's a simple verse in the Torah, in Aseret Dibros. So now, listen to that. The Gemarah says, I'll tell you. The ruling of the Sanhedrin said is the following. They said that when there is a bowing to, let's say, Peor, or let's give another example, Markulis. You know what is Markulis? Markulis is an idol that the way they worshipped it, the Gentiles, is not by bowing to it, by throwing stones at it. So comes the Gemarah and offers the following offer. That Tzdokim, of course they concede that one is not allowed to bow to avodah zarah, but only when that's the form of that avodah zarah, that's what the idol worshippers are doing. But in these cases, in these idols that the idol worshippers are not bowing to it, that's not part of their practice. Here, there is no prohibition to bow to it. So if a Sanhedrin said one is allowed to bow to Markulis, then that is a chiddush, enough of a chiddush that a public bull is still brought, because the Tzdokim, it's not a trivial law that the Tzdokim agree with, that one is not allowed to bow to Markulis. Now look at that. That is exactly in the structure that I told you before. The Gemarah maintained the principle of the Mishnah that even uprooting a category, a bull is brought. Because that's an entire category, not to bow to avodah zarah. It's like one of the 39 malachos. there was a problem to implement it because it seems to be a pshat pasuk in the Torah. Well, they say that the tzdokim actually read the pshat pasuk of the Torah in a very limited way, and therefore I maintained this uprooting the concept regarding the case of Markulis. In the case of Markulis, it's a very, very important thing that one is not allowed to bow to it. It's mamish one of the categories of idol worshiping, and yet still the tzdokim are not conceding to it. Now, of course, what's a little surprising, here I'm saying my comment. Okay, so the Gemarah gave a solution. But my comment to it, that l'chora, the pshat of the pasuk is lo tishtachaveh lahem, lo yeh lecha elohim acharim al panai, the second commandment. You should not have other gods. Lo tishtachaveh lahem. You should not bow to them. That's very inclusive. That's the pshat. After the limiting is a chochmah. And the Gemarah here attributes it to the tzdokim. We have to say that the tzdokim are reading the psukim in the following way. That lo tishtachaveh lahem is not an absolute statement, as our sages understand. But lo tishtachaveh lahem is just an example. Usually, most gods, the way to worship them is by bowing. So the tzdokim are saying here what we say in the sages, diber hakatuv bahoveh, meaning the Torah spoke about the classic cases. In most idols, the way the Gentiles worship them is also by bowing, most idols. So that's what the Torah talked about. But that was the example, the classic example. What is really prohibited is not an absolute prohibition of bowing. When the Torah said lo tishtachaveh, it just said don't worship them in the classic way, in the way they're worshipped. And therefore bowing to Markolis, according to the tzdokim, is not included. So only our sages who said no, lo tishtachaveh lahem is an absolute statement. But here it's a very example that it's very interesting that l'chora, the tzdokim thing was, as I said to David Goodwin last week, it's a lakmus paper to show when a mistake of Sanhedrin is so evident that you can't call it even a ruling, and therefore a public bull is not brought. But can we say this about this example? Meaning here, this vikuach, how to interpret the verses, yeah? And even though the verse says explicitly, lo tishtachaveh, it seems a very evident mistake. So no, they say the fact that the pasuk could be interpreted in terms of pshat, there are two equal suggestions how to explain the pshat, whether merely as an example or an absolute statement. This is really here the vikuach. Here the vikuach with its tzdokim is not about pshat and drash. That's what I want to say. Here the vikuach is how to understand the pshat. There are two legitimate ways. Lo tishtachaveh is merely an example, the most prominent example, or it's an absolute statement. But here, the minute that there could be a disagreement regarding how to interpret the pshat, that is already passing the threshold that you bring a public bull, because that means that it's not zil kare beirav, okay? It's not a mistake that every 3-year-old would understand that it's a mistake, okay? This is how I understand this Gemarah. So the Gemarah even expands and stretches this principle of the tzdokim. But I think that dafka here, I have to say that this elaboration makes sense to me. Makes sense to me that the minute that there are two equal ways to interpret the pshat, that is already enough that a public bull will be brought. Okay, let's go on. So the first answer was, Yastira ishtachavaya kedarka, aval shelo kedarka sharia. Bibai seima, and another answer to another way to defend the Mishnah in the Gemarah, the Amre ishtachavaya gufa kedarka udeasir deit bapishut yadayim veraglayim. Aishtachavaya delayed bapishut yadayim veraglayim sharia. Interesting. Meaning, again, we all agree that there is an explicit verse in the second commandment of the 10 commandments of the Torah. There is an explicit commandment not to bow, prohibition not to bow to idols. Everyone agrees with that. The Tzdokim also. The question is, what does the word hishtachavaya mean? The classic way to bow is fall down with throwing your hands and legs, like we do in Yom Kippur. A complete action of bowing, a full action of bowing. And then there's the bowing that is merely bowing. See with my hand. A person is, what we do in Shemona Esrei, maybe even less. No pishut yadayim v'raglayim. So the claim is that the Tzdokim are saying, you know what? When it says lo tishtachaveh, that means only the complete action is prohibited. But bowing without the stretching the hands of falling down, that is not prohibited. And then so what the Mishnah talked about is, when did the Mishnah say that it's an Sanhedrin that's saying that there is avodah zarah in the Torah, but throwing your hands and legs are not included? Okay. No, but yeah, excuse me, but bowing with a regular bowing without throwing hands and legs, without falling on the ground, this is permitted. This is a thing that is actually not, it's not a simple ruling. It's not something that the Tzdokim can see. Now here again, look at that. It's not a question of a midrash here. To say that hishtachavaya includes not only falling down, but also bowing, that's again a machloket how to interpret the word. The word could mean both. And you assume that the Tzdokim are saying, no, it's only the most strict way, falling down. Okay, but once you said it, so it's not a trivial ruling, because if there is a way to say that tishtachavaya is only when you fall on the ground, then that's already not a trivial ruling, and a public bull is brought. All right, now Rashi helps us a little bit. Look at the last Rashi on the page. Hishtachava, it's in the left side, left column, the very last Rashi. It's one row from the bottom. Hishtachavaya, befishut yadayim v'raglayim. That's what the Tzdokim claim, that what was prohibited in the Torah and the second commandment is only falling down on the ground and throwing your hands and legs. Pishut yadayim v'raglayim. That's hishtachava. Dechtiv vayishtachu apayim arza. Meaning there is a verse in Bereshis that juxtaposed to vayishtachu apayim, to vayishtachu is apayim arza. So the Tzdokim understand that that is the meaning of the terminology of vishtachavaya. Vishtachavot apayim arza. By the way, I could have said exactly the opposite. Pshat, I'm saying. Only when it's written vayishtachu apayim arza, then it's falling on the ground. But when it says vayishtachu lo, then it's not apayim arza. If you want to say that it's falling on the ground, then you say it. Meaning, dafka, the fact that the Torah detailed there, apayim arza, might imply that ishtachavaya is actually a much more general term. By the way, we see here a common denominator, not the same, not exactly the same, but I see the first answer of the Gemarah. What was the machlokus between the Tzdokim and the rabbis? Whether the prohibition of ishtachava, of bowing, is absolute, or only when it's the manner of the avodah zarah. So again, the sages were more inclusive. Here, halachically, the terminology, the technical terminology of ishtachavaya is the same. But the question is whether ishtachavaya has a meaning only when it's the classic way of worship, or it has an objective meaning, more inclusive. And here the machlokas was, Do I limit ishtachavaya only? Ishtachavaya means only mamash falling down. That is idol worshiping. Or no, it is more inclusive. It's a more inclusive term. Interesting that it's consistent that the tzdokim are limiting more the interpretation in context of Avodah Zarah. Okay, let's go now to flip the page. We're in Dalet Amud Beis. By Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef asked the following question. Ein harisha b'Shabbos mahu. Let's say that's a classic question. Meaning, and el-chor, the answer is simple. No, not, because there is an explicit verse regarding harisha also. Becharishu v'katzir tishbot. Rav Yosef is asking the following question. If Sanhedrin is ruling that there is a Shabbos, but one is allowed to plow. L'chora, that's identical to the example of the Mishnah. The example of the Mishnah was, there is a Shabbos, but one is allowed to carry. Here the Mishnah said that a public bull is brought. Now the Gemarah had a problem with it because there is a verse in Jeremiah prohibiting carrying, and the Gemarah gave an answer that it's regarding achnasa or regarding throwing. Now Rav Yosef asks about harisha. Now l'chora, what's the question? Of course, if they say there is no harisha, then l'chora, if you apply the principles of the Mishnah that uprooting a category, a bull is brought, so a bull should be brought. So what is this question? By Rav Yosef ein harisha b'Shabbos mau. Mi amrinan, do we say Evan de kamodu bekulu milta? Oh, Dilma, Kevan de Arkaryan Lily Licharisha, Kol Ikar Keakirat Guf Dami. Wow, I'm so happy about this, Rav Yosef, even though I learned it already weeks ago, but I'm again excited from learning it. You remember how we had issue with the Mishnah that uprooting an entire malacha seemed to us also akirat haguf, seemed to us a davar velo chatzi davar. But we humbly accepted the pshat of the Mishnah that only uprooting a concept is akirat haguf. But it seems that Rav Yosef had the same problem. He says, do I say because they concede that there is a Shabbos, and one, let's say, is not allowed to cook, and one is not allowed to plant, and one is not allowed to carry. So the fact that they say one is allowed to plow, that is already meeting the criteria of bringing a public bull. Or maybe since you uproot the entire malacha of harisha, this is considered akira saguf. It's like uprooting a concept, meaning uprooting a category and a concept is already both akira taguf. Now, what's the basis for his question? It seems that the pshat of the Mishnah is very clear. It seems that the basis is because he has a problem with the pshat of the Mishnah. So he will try to work it out. And now the floor is open to him because we said that regarding otzah, it didn't mean a real otzah, it meant only throwing, okay? A detail. So that opens the door. Let's see Rashi. By Rav Yosef, for ein charisha b'Shabbos no. Lo mitba'alei Rav Yosef b'davar she'en tzdokim modim klal. Ela bebitol miktzat v'kiyu miktzat kami ba'alei. Meaning, Rashi explains so that you won't be confused. The Gemarah made here in a whole interrogation and Shakla V'Taya trying to challenge the principle of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, that when the tzdokim agree with something, such a ruling, a public bull is not brought. A ruling that contradicts something that even the tzdokim agree with, a public bull is not brought. The Gemarah brought three challenges from the pre-cases of the Mishnah, and the Gemarah answered it by Ukimto. And that's the end of that discussion. Rashi clarifies. We're now starting a new sugya. Now we're not challenging the principle of tzdokim. Now we're going back to the Mishnah and we're analyzing the principle of the Mishnah. What is considered uprooting haguf, akira saguf? Is it, as seems from the pshat of the Mishnah, only when you uproot an entire concept, like Shabbat, Nida, Avodah Zarah, but when you uproot even a big category within that concept, that is already not considered akira saguf and a public bull is brought? Or, as Rav Yosef here tries to challenge and say, no, maybe the Mishnah does mean, and I'll explain the Mishnah, he'll have a debt to do so, that akira saguf is not only when one says there's no Shabbos, but also when one says there's no plowing on Shabbos, there's no prohibition to plow on Shabbos. This is already considered akirat haguf, uprooting an entire body of Torah that no public bull is brought. And it has nothing to do with the question about the tzedokим. Okay? Now, so that's what Rashi clarifies. Mi amrinan, I am Kevan de Kamodu Beidin Bekulu Sha'ar Malachos the Shabbos, the Asiri. Since they accept all the 38 other malachos, so this is already considered bitul miktzat v'kiyu miktzat dami, and they're obligated to bring a public bull. Or no, since they uprooted the entire category of harisha, it's kakirat aguf. One could have said that this Gemarah, as Rashi presents it, totally disconnected with the previous Gemarah. And it's really trying to find out generally if malachos are considered guf or not. Each malacha is a guf or not, an entire body of Torah considered. I might say that maybe it's not a coincidence that the question is on harisha, because there is a verse on harisha as opposed to cooking. It says in Parshat Mishpatim, we'll read it next week, Becharish sheshet yamim ta'avod, uvashvi'i tishbot, becharish uvekatzir tishbot. Now, it's true that our sages dafka interpret this verse as referring to Shemitah, but the pshat is that it refers to Shabbos. And here you say an explicit pasuk that says that one is not allowed to plow. So I can say that it's uprooting a body, and it's especially true according to Zish's formulation that I said that Toso disagree with, that actually these two formulation of the Mishnah and the Tzdokim, Guf Davar and what the Tzdokim admit with, are identical. Now, let's see how the Gemarah answers, and then we'll finish. Tashma. Yesh nida b'Torah. I'm the fifth line from the top of the page of Dalet Amud Beis. Tashma yesh nida b'Torah. Abal abal shomeret yom keneged yom patur. Ve'amay ha'akar yam l'shomeret yom keneged yom kol ikar. Ah, very nice. Rav Yosef had a suffix regarding a malacha, and here you see, here is a proof that he doesn't talk only about harisha, he talks really about a category. So you say, here, we're proving to you that actually, from the other examples of the Mishnah, from the Nida example, that it's even uprooting an entire category within a concept. That is sufficient to bring a public bull. So now, look at how the Gemarah dismisses that proof. The Kamrin Kedeshanian. We already explained that it talks really about a mistake in a detail. That it talks about incomplete act of Shomer Yom. Or if it was at night and not at day. So you see that uprooting the entire concept of Shomer Yom Keneged Yom is already considered Akira Saguf. The same regarding Harisha. First of all, Zish, here from the flow of the Gemarah, you might have support dafka to your way of learning, though it seems clear that Rashi disagreed with it. However, what is supporting here is that as opposed to what I presented you regarding Gukimto, here what I'm happy to see is that the Gemarah, in a very subtle way, in the way they're editing the sugya, are really agreeing with me and David Goodwin. Meaning, we said it's so hard to accept that uprooting an entire category, still a public bull will be brought. If we say like Gabe explained, that an extreme level of ignorance, one cannot bring public bull because it's either an onus or a mazid, it's not a shogeg, so no public bull is brought. But then we say, well, hello, someone that says that there is no plowing on Shabbos, that is also falling under the basket of extreme ignorance. So how come the Mishnah gives these as an examples? So here, actually, that's the intention of Rav Yosef and the Gemarah here, to say, even though the pshat of the Mishnah, that a mistake in an entire category, already a public bull is brought, and we found it hard to understand. But no, we always explain the Mishnah, these cases, as mistakes in details. And then Rabbi Yosef here now is saying it explicitly. Therefore, I conclude that if Sanhedrin is saying there is a Shabbos in the Torah, but one is allowed to plow, if I would have read the pshat of the Mishnah, I would say, clear cut, a public bull is brought. But because I have the explanations of the Gemarah that are saying that it's only mistakes in details, as opposed to the pshat, so therefore, Allah if one says there's one is allowed to plow, no public bull is brought. So actually, the Gemarah uprooted the pshat of the Mishnah, so it will agree with our logic, with the Goodwin, with all of our logic, that really the source of Torah from the essence of Torah exemption from public bull is when there is only when there is a very ignorant, extreme ignorant mistake. Let's continue. Tashma, Ye Shabbos b'Torah. Another attempt to prove. Aval hamotzi merishut seichut lerishut patur. Ve'amai ha'akarian lo tza'ah kol ikar. They are uprooting the entire malacha of hotzah. And you see that they are bringing a public bull. Therefore, a public bull should be brought when you say one is allowed to plow. Again, the Gemarah here offers the pshat of the Mishnah as a very straightforward proof to say that when one says there is a Shabbos, but one is allowed to plow, a public bull will be brought, because it's totally identical to a Sanhedrin that are saying there is a Shabbos, but one is allowed to carry. The Gemarah says, "Hatam nami kedashainan." What do you mean? There also we limited the explanation of the Mishnah to only throwing. Tashma, yesh avodas kochavim b'Torah, aval mishtachave patur, ve'amai ha'akarian lishtachavaya. Again, you uprooted an entire category of bowing. Amri ishtachavaya nami kedeshaninan. Ishtachavaya also we limited the explanation of the Mishnah to only bowing in certain cases, or bowing without falling on the ground. That's the end of this piece. And we'll stop here. But this is a very exciting piece. We saw that the Gemarah actually, in a very sophisticated and clever and subtle way, uprooted the pshat of the Mishnah. And I think it wasn't naive. It was because the logic didn't fit, or our logic, or the Gemarah didn't fit the pshat of the Mishnah, right? When I say our logic, I mean Gabe's initial explanation. Gabe's initial explanation was, why when there's a ruling to uproot an entire goof, an entire thing, why no public bull is brought? Because that's extreme ignorance. And therefore it's either a mazid or an anus, it's not a shogeg. We said, yes, great. However, the pshat of the continuation of the Mishnah seems to contradict this explanation, because the Mishnah gives cases of uprooting very, very fundamental things. Uprooting that there is that the Mishnah says that one brings a bull, a Sanhedrin brings a bull when they say that one is allowed to bow to an idol. That a bull is brought when Sanhedrin says that one is allowed to carry on Shabbos. These are also extreme ignorances. So the Gemarah says, you know what, you're right. And actually the Mishnah is not pshat. All of these examples are very detailed, are specific examples, not as it appears from the simple wordings. That also explains us, by the way, that in the previous page, I don't know if you all remember, I told you that the Gemarah refuses to make the distinction between category and detail. You remember they didn't explain, they had a simple answer for a Baraita, and they went this. Why? Simply because they were ignoring the distinction between detail and category. Well, that fits what I'm saying, because they never acknowledged the fact that a category one brings, when uprooting a category one brings a bull. That was clear to them that a category is just like a concept. Consequently, they understood that the pshat of the Mishnah is really, even though it's against the pshat, the Mishnah talks about mistakes and details. Only mistaken details, a public bull is brought. Okay. Shabbat shalom lekulam.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.